Good morning, everyone, and welcome to those of you who are having their very first week at summer school this year. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Antonia Malan of the Tracing History Trust. Dr. Malan studied archaeology and completed a PhD at UCT in 1993. Her research focus has been people and places of the 18th and 19th century Cape Colony, leading to a deep interest in vernacular architecture and the spatial development of Cape Town and its hinterland. She unearths the life stories of houses, families, and their servants and slaves. She acts as a consultant in multidisciplinary heritage assessment teams and sits on heritage advisory committees. Welcome, Dr. Malan.
Thank you very much indeed. I think I have to use a microphone, although the acoustics here are excellent. How's that? Good. Good. As you've seen in your program, I'm kicking off as a member of the Tracing History Trust, and then during the week you will hear from other members of the team, the transcription team, and two people who've used our transcriptions for various reasons. And I'd also like to just welcome you, and those of you who aren't familiar with Cape Town, just to explain that the extreme wind conditions are nothing new. In the 1720s, Francois Valentin reported that it was blowing so hard when he was crossing the parade, he dove into a pothole. Much to his surprise, he found somebody else already there. So together, they waited until the wind abated. So I'm talking about the spatial history of early Cape Town, but actually it's a rather peculiar combination of what we're trying to do this week is to explain that we have incredible resources in the archives and in other places. Images, documents, and so on. We have completely untold, unexplored treasures. And part of our purpose is to explore them, to expose them, and then to make some stories. So what you'll hear today is a lot about people, rather than the sort of technicalities of the documents themselves. So I'm starting with early Cape history. By that I mean early Cape colonial history, which really has focused on the relationships between the company, the Dutch East India Company, the Khoisan, the colonists, the settling of farmers and their Cape Dutch architecture, and then the spread of the Trek Boers into the hinterland. But the origins and the evolution of the mother city rather got left behind. Of course, the exceptions were Nigel Worden and Vivian Bickford-Smith's amazing illustrated volumes on the history of Cape Town in the late 90s. And then a later project, also led by Nigel Worden, this time with Sue Newton King, which was published as Cape Town Between East and West in 2012. And the team there focused on the material culture, the social identities of the 1730s, more or less. The questions were, what did the place look like? Who lived where? Who else was around the town? What were they doing with and to each other? And how did they succeed or fail? And how did the early Cape compare with other places, hence between East and West? And it's really important, too, to remember that Cape Town was imposed on a landscape without urban precedent. This made it very unlike any other Dutch East India enterprises, where the company took over either existing trade routes, from the Portuguese in particular, and existing trade centres, or they then adapted existing settlements. So it really was a new settlement. Who lived here? Otto Menzel, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, one of the most perceptive writers about the colony, lived in the Cape in the 1730s, although he only wrote about it much later. And he simply described the inhabitants in terms of a social hierarchy. The VOC senior officials at the top, the lower ranking employees of the VOC, the burgher elite, the other burghers, and finally a sort of underclass that consisted of free blacks, in other words, manumitted slaves or convicts, soldiers, sailors, and slaves themselves. So a large proportion of company employees and the settlers in the town owned at least one slave, which meant that the Cape was every bit as much a slave society as its Indian Ocean counterparts. And in 1731, which is one of the few years with a complete record of the demographic profile, slaves formed about 40% of the population, with VOC employees making up 30%, free burghers 20%, freed slaves and convicts 10%. Note that I don't have numbers or information here about indigenous people, and this is a huge hole in our information, and it's a constant attempt and struggle to dive into those records as well. So this is largely about the immigrant population and how they built the city. So how did the ordinary people of the time, that's that one. Anyway. So how did the ordinary people of the time see and experience the place? So in the buildings and the streets of early Cape Town, there were indigenous men and women, mariners, officials, militia, slaves, men, women, children, the righteous and the criminal, as somebody put it. Sailors, soldiers, fishermen, washerwomen, herdsmen and wood collectors were moving across the landscape of the mountains, the rivers, the sea, the pastures, and the seashore and dunes. Their impressions and experiences, of course, are rarely recorded. So I looked for ways of visualizing the place, and obviously the travelers' descriptions, remember, they were designed for the people back home. There's images, there's cadastral and property records, there's court cases, and household inventories, which has been our particular interest, and other useful sources. So what did the Cape settlement really look like? There are very few images of early Cape Town, such as pictures or maps, and most are fanciful or made for a particular purpose. Leela can tell us about this. As Keir Sunfleet wrote in a wonderful book called Mapping for Money, despite their apparent attention to accuracy, it should not be forgotten that neither wall maps nor topographic paintings are true to life representations. The draftsmen on the spot produced images which reflected their interests and those of the local authorities. Artists and patrons changed, combined, improved and polished the original drawings. Bird's-eye views of entire towns were in some cases based on a horizontal view from a ship, together with a schematic plan. And in this process, houses were invented and the appearance of buildings was altered. This is one of my favourites. It's what I call the roundy view. So for a sailor, as you can imagine, it's the profile of the shore that they're interested in. However, they've also inserted a plan onto this roundy view. They're absolutely delightful. Ironically, E. van Stade's drawings of 1710 were originally assumed to be fanciful because no buildings of this style survived. Yet they turned out to be some of the most important records of early architecture. Architectural historians, archaeologists have shown that such buildings really did exist. They found evidence from excavated foundations and from descriptions in archival documents. And this drawing shows what the buildings in the early Cape looked like, how they were arranged relative to each other, and their setting within the landscape. Unfortunately, they don't show any people. Here's the church, so that must have been brand new. Company warehouses, and over here, this towards this side, were the private dwellings of the burghers. When you start combining the different sources, the maps start coming alive. So here's an early plan of the Cape settlement in the 1660s. It was created for the year in 17 to demonstrate that all the elements of a proper VOC outpost had been put in place. That was its purpose. It labels and marks the major features and buildings, such as the hospital, the church, the garden, and the warehouses. Here's the hospital. They can then be identified in Stada's drawing. There's the hospital. Some traces still lie buried beneath our feet, but frustratingly few from the earliest period. This is one of the most frustrating archaeological sites in Cape Town. It was discovered when they built the Golden Acre, and portions of the freshwater reservoir, Wagenaar's Dam, were exposed during the building operations. And a remnant, you can find a remnant next to the escalator in the Golden Acre building. But this was the 1970s, and urban archaeology and historical archaeology didn't exist. So there was no framework in which to do the work, and it was literally a salvage job, an emergency salvage job. So we have a collection of artifacts, but with very little archaeological information. Then I saw this painting on a cover of the book by Alistair Sparks. I can't remember its name. I've never seen the original. I got a slide from Museum Africa, but they had no information about its context or who the artist was. So I compared it to the Stada drawing and worked out from looking at the buildings that it was painted after 1710, which is the Stada drawing, and before 1740, when certain buildings should have been there. To my delight, I don't know if you can see, but there are also some people on the beach. Yes. Not better? Oh, sorry about that. Somebody should complain. Please complain. So what I then did was, I thought, well, I better share this with some Dutch maritime archaeologists. One of the ship has a name on it, and one of the ship has an emblem of an oak tree on it. So sure enough, they can tell me exactly which ships they were. And even more amazingly, a friend of his could prove that those two vessels were only together at the same time in Table Bay in 1727. So that was really exciting. In a precise statement, I could use the picture as a basis for imagining what Cape Town might have looked like in the 1730s. I have to say that with one success, there are 10 failures in this sort of thing. So the next step was to explore other sources. Trot off to the Surveyor General's and the Deeds Office. All private property transactions were formally registered. The documents recorded the seller's and the new owner's name, the extent of the property, who the neighbours were, and other things. Grants are accompanied by a survey diagram. Land grants have precisely defined measurements of extent in Morgan, square roots, feet, and Damon. But they're only vaguely fixed in space. So here is a description of the relative position of a property in relation to its neighbours. Some house plots within the grid of streets were given a block and a lot reference. like A3002. But it wasn't until the mid-18th century that a master plan was drawn up by David Wenzel. We'll see it later. So some properties were merely described as being adjacent to a particular place or a particular person, what I think of to myself as landmarks and people marks. So here we have the warehouse of Henning Crane, the Free Blacks, Aaron van Batavia and Titus van Makassar, the corner house of predicant Passir. Now these descriptions therefore tell me all sorts of things about the neighbourhood. But places such as, there was a place called the Schotse Temple and the Vlagemanshuisie. They were once very familiar landmarks, but have since been forgotten. Here's a much later plan. And why I love this picture, I know nothing about it. Somebody must have commissioned it. It's been separated from its... Oh yes, this is one of the archival curiosities. Maps that were too big to be bound into files were separated from their correspondence, and there was no cross-link. So one of the exciting things is that you find maps in no context, and then your imagination has to just start working. Anyway, the reason I love this is, first of all, it's pretty. Probably mid to late 18th century. What it shows is the ordered town grid and the organic garden land, so clearly contrasted. I hope you can see from the back. So, importantly, what I discovered was that in the grants there are building plots, which is a haste and F.
Can you show where the company gardens are, please?
Sure. There.
Okay.
See, they came right down to Well Street. So you've got the, yeah.
Thank you.
And right up to the top. So they were very formal. So in a way, you're right to point them out as yet another level of, but they weren't a land grant, so I'm not talking about them. So the haste and F would have been in those red grid blocks. There were garden plots, haste and tame, and you find these around what's now known as the gardens, which is around this area. Okay. You find them around Stellenbosch. You find them in grants, for instance, we were working in Kapteinskloof. It's where you can do intensive agriculture, horticulture. That had a special name in the grants. And gardens were different from farms. A farm was called a Hofstede en Plaats, a homestead on a farm. So they were conceived as very different sorts of landholdings, and that's of interest to me. So people could own one or two sorts, some people, the wealthy, owned three. So the location and the layout of the garden lands, obviously they had to ensure access to water, a stream or a spring. And the thing about Table Mountain is that springs come out all around it. The shape was then adapted to the ridges and the valleys on the lower slopes of the mountain. They were intensively farmed with grain, fruit, vegetables, poultry and livestock, and vines. We know this, for instance, from the household of Angela of Bengalen, the widowed Basson. Among the other things, she had a small flock of goats as well as a brandy still on her garden land, and her slaves would have carried the fresh produce down into the town to sell. The slopes of Devil's Peak and Signal Hill, this side, weren't so well watered and were used for grazing and a small amount of dairy farming. So we have a very intensively settled and productive land in Table Valley. Now I'm going more towards the inventories and the associated documents.
Sorry, just one quick question. What is the settlement all the way on the left?
This.
Yeah.
If that's the castle, that would be...
Is that Mowbray?
No. It would be. Sorry, I'm glad.
Barnett.
No. Zonneblue. Thank you.
Oh, Zonneblue.
Yeah. Sorry. The scale. We haven't got a scale here. No, that's close. So this is District 6. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And the word card, is that already built?
Well, you have, that's Bree Street. This is late 18th century. So it's already gone across Bree Street, and this is still in the corridor. So it's pre-Gorkha. The Tracing History Trust has transcribed several volumes of handwritten archives. By several, I mean lots, including the inventories and auction records of the Master of the Orphan Chamber at the Cape of Good Hope, which were written between 1673 and 1834. The inventories list all the possessions of a deceased estate, whether he or she was rich or poor, young or old. This is different to the British inheritance system. It's based on equal and partible inheritance. So nobody could be disinherited, and men and women were equal in terms of ownership and bequests. Unlike the British system, where you had primogeniture, and so the eldest son was always privileged. So what that means is these documents represent, they're very representative of the society. They record the contents of buildings and cupboards and boxes, stores and workshops. They list livestock and slaves. And if an estate was insolvent, there were no heirs to inherit perhaps, it was auctioned. Then you have an auction roll, a rendu-roll, which lists the objects sold, who bought them, and for how much. And Tracy Randall will be pursuing that line. So to me, to all of us, there cannot be a more effective time machine than a close reading of a family's household inventory. They're intensely rich resources. They're astonishing artifacts for creating an impression of the built environment, material culture, the lives of a whole range of people. They paint a vivid picture of the world of the early Cape inhabitants, the ways they made and used the place, and they mark the sometimes very poignant traces of a frozen moment in the past. They are an analyst's dream. This is a list of jewellery and gold and silver objects with bequests to various people and a valuation. The valuations in the inventories or in the auction rolls have been used by economic historians, particularly in Stellenbosch, and Johan Fourie will be talking about those on Thursday. They've done amazing number crunching, which is only possible because they've been transcribed, I have to say.
Sorry, just quickly to interrupt. Those valuations, would they be similar to Dutch valuations, or did we have a different value system?
We had the same value system. It was riksdollars, shillings.
No, what I mean is a candlestick, let's say a silver candlestick here would have roughly the same value here as it would in Holland.
Not necessarily, and that's the point. We can compare. So we can compare with North American inventories, Dutch inventories, British inventories, once you've got this information captured. Right. For the architectural historian, it's also possible to reconstruct the layout of a household from inventories. Because for the appraisers, the people recording everything in a house, the easiest way of dealing with hundreds of entries is to record the contents of the household room by room. So here you have achterkamer, voorkamer, voorhuis, kombuis. You also know what's inside the room. You can start doing some interpretation. So the function of a room can be interpreted from the things in it. For example, Barron's was a silversmith. The Voorhuis acted as a shop, as it was smartly furnished with 12 chairs, a standing clock, 7 bird cages, and a silversmith's tools. It was decorated with pictures and 5 porcelain dishes, so it acted as normally as the main entrance room to the house, but all his goodies was there. He was working in there as well. The kitchen had 6 chimney chains and 2 bellows, indicating that smithing activities as well as cooking took place on what was a larger than average hearth. So that's how we start getting into the interpretation. Rooms were named according to their position relative to the front entrance. So recorded in the order the appraisers came upon them as they circulated through the house. So the first room behind the front door was usually named the Voorhuis. Then came rooms to left or right, sometimes called front rooms, voorkamers. There could be an internal room, binnenkamer, a mezzanine floor, opkamer, upper rooms, boorkamers. Sometimes there was a large room, grote kamer, and a small room, kamertjie, klein kamer. Functional names were only used for service rooms, such as the kitchen, the conveys, pantry, dispense or bottlery, and a workshop, winkel or cellar, kelder. It was only in the late 18th century, and particularly after Anglicisation affected the material culture of the Cape, that rooms were more often named according to their function rather than their position. So we find rooms, the slaapkamer, eetkamer, zitkamer. And this, importantly, was because they had become single-purpose rooms, which is important. Right, so I've done the sort of background stuff, and I'm going to use a woman called Hermina Herwig and her family just to illustrate how we've pulled the documents together to make a story. She, and I've used some Dutch interior paintings. She was married 4 times. Over that series of marriages, they established a very successful tannery shoemaking business in partnership with the husbands and with at least 3 apprentices or collector and 15 adult slaves. India, the East Indies, Madagascar, and those born at the Cape of slave mothers. Hermina bore 8 children over 10 years when married to the cobbler Kretschmar, 3 of whom survived into adulthood. She had a lammerkie with her 3rd husband, the previous apprentice, Martins, and her 4th husband, the silversmith, was 16 years younger than her. Now, she started off with almost nothing. The death of her first husband, Abraham Stahl, in 1708, they were living in a rented house, and after all expenses were paid, she ended up with only 190 guilders to her name. By the time she died, 23 years later, aged about 51, she owned an extensive business, 10 houses and lots, 10 house lots, 6 adjoining houses in blocks V, V and X. Her sons inherited a market garden called earlyCape, in today's Runizit, and a 4-day auction of the estate realised 4,450 Rix for the heirs. The list of her jewellery is amazing. One of the things that the historian Gerald Groenewald has pointed out is how Germans, in this period, Germans who came to the Cape, used each other as a network. So they married each other, they married into each other's families, they helped each other, they lent each other money. And they got things like the alcohol licenses. That was one of their specialities. And interestingly, one of Hermina's daughters, Katharina, married a German widower, Jan van der Swain. He'd already done very well by marrying into the alcohol business. The family's tannery was situated on the eastern edge of the residential area. This is a much later picture, 1770s. Next to the company stables in Stall Plain, very sensibly, where the horses and cattle hides were available to make their leather products. And the memory of tanneries remained there in the form of the name Lawyers Plain until the Roman Catholic Church was built on that square. Now, from the layout described in the inventory, despite the wealth of the family, the workshops are right up against the dwelling houses, and the stink must have spread some distance around. 2 horses and a pig lived in the yard behind the house. I just love those details, and I managed to find an obscure picture. There's the pig being fed. The Cape architecture at this period was experimental. There was a great variety of residential buildings, and only much later, in the 1740s, were houses designed to be more strictly symmetrical and transverse to the street. In other words, your Cape Dutch house. After the 1740s, reading the inventories, everything became more standardized. You can predict what's going to be where in the house and what the house is going to look like. In this period, that was not true. So despite the lack of suitable building materials, timber and hard-break brick, the first substantial dwelling houses reproduced European styles. As soon as this was people preferred the Grootkamer layout. It's a big multi-purpose living room with a hearth, and it was behind it an asymmetrical facade on the street. The clues in the inventories are hearth utensils or a scoorstien mantel or a scoorstien phalanx above the fireplace. In early Dutch North America, this great chamber was the most important room beside the kitchen. And these great rooms were the rooms in which daily life and work took place. The family also ate their meals. Once she could afford to, Hermina did the same. She chose this traditional European style. Her inventory in 1731 records the large multi-purpose living room with a great fireplace. And this space lay behind 2 more modest front rooms, was crowded with cabinets, furniture, fittings. The windows and curtain bed were draped with red fabric. Why did the Cape Dutch plan take over? It was a desire that the big fireplace, the big living in a big living room, was designed probably for keeping warm. In the Cape, most of the time you want to keep cool. Also, there was this trend towards symmetry, a wish for symmetry, yes.
Is that perhaps concept?
Do you know what? I absolutely can't remember what it is.
Looks familiar.
Yes, I mean, sorry, I can't remember at all. So at the Cape, you don't find fireplaces in the Cape Dutch house in the living rooms. Very rarely. Maybe it's practical factors. You don't want a hearth in the middle of a thatched roof, so you put it at the end of the tail of a T as a kitchen. People could keep themselves warm with a stove, a perforated box with hot coals in. And the later kitchen at the Cape was almost never a family living room, which could be related to domestic slavery. So I've written further about it, so I won't go on about it now because we're running out of time. This Grootkamer disappeared from the inventories by mid-18th century. The new fashion was symmetry, the house facade facing the street, there was plenty of space. What happened was that this special purpose eating room, the Gouderij, became the centre of the house. It was on a central axis. It could be fitted well within a symmetrical arrangement of rooms. The house could be kept cool by a through draft in summer. So for various reasons, the Cape vernacular house was developed. When we were thinking about space, I came across the writings of Nicolaas Ondatje, who quite rightly and obviously talks about space and sense of place is more to do with sightscapes, soundscapes and smellscapes. And he contrasts the city as a concept, as it's mapped and often as it's drawn, as a unified whole, sort of compartmentalized. And by contrast, the experience of the city by somebody walking through the streets, or running away through the streets, or whatever they were doing in the streets. So thinking about space, I think in a way what I'm trying to get there is combining the evidence to start to get an idea of what it felt like to be in the streets of Cape Town. And this means you need to think about the wider context. The gridded town was set in a dangerous wilderness of steep heights, rocks and scrubby plants. According to Francois Valentino, untamed animals. The court cases show that there were people on the run lurking around its edges. The streets weren't protected within fortified walls. There were sort of symbolic attempts at creating canals as barriers, but they were basically rubbish-filled ditches. The company gardens were evoked by most commentators as safely exotic, a familiar European layout and plants as well as the strange plants imported from Asia. The townhouses and estates of the landed gentry were often compared favourably with their European inspirations. But taverns, corner cafes, cockfighting dens, attics, rooftop and alley escape routes, hiding places are described in court cases. From the margins all around, I've always got a sense of Cape Town as people could see without being seen. Cape Town was a face-to-face society where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the attempts to maintain social and official distinctions to control disruptive elements was a constant discourse in the company records. And court cases reveal fascinating details and the realities of social and spatial relations. The Trials of Slavery, edited by Gerald Grunfeld and Nigel Worden, is fascinating reading. And this was an attempt to locate the scene of the crime. The gardens also provided places to meet, to take refuge for people escaping from surveillance or the scene of a crime. And in 1736, after a fire broke out at a tannery, I don't know if it was Hermina's, the fiscal took the opportunity to berate both the rogues who caused it and their neglectful owners for allowing them to congregate out there unsupervised and robbed. Hermina Herwig was also the victim of a crime shortly after her husband Kretschmar died in 1719. In that case, she was stabbed by her slave Jonas van Manado. The evidence at the trial revealed several interesting clues that fleshed out any interpretation of the inventory. I'm just going to quickly run through it, summarising the testimony, and you will pick up on the clues to daily lived lives. 3 hours after noon, when Hermina was busy in the attic of her residence, the slave Jonas came to her, handed over a certain document and said, "There, Juffrouw," without saying anything further. After this, when they separated, this slave went to the bark house. That's the tanning house. Jonas had presented his mistress with a letter requesting his freedom, which he was expecting after the death of his owner, Kretschmar. However, Hermina refused the request. A few months later, on Friday the 13th, Hermina was sitting and eating at the table with her knechten, Jan van Es, Willem Main and Jan Smuts. Now we've got the names of the apprentices. She asked Jonas if something was wrong, that he would not eat, to which he answered he was a bit drunk. After his mistress had eaten, so first of all they're eating together, after his mistress had eaten, instead of going to his usual sleeping place in the attic, another clue, he hid himself in her bedroom under the bed. with the intention to steal. After she'd had her meal, she assumed that Jonas had already, as was customary, gone to the attic to sleep, and betook herself along with 4 children to bed. So they all climbed into the big curtained bed with the red hangings. At midnight, he came out from under the bed and went to a table upon which was a bottle of wine and drank from the bottle. While doing this, the little daughter, by the name of Katrine, woke up, noticed the slave, roused her mother, stuck her head through the curtains, saw this Jonas and asked the same, "Jonas, what are you doing here?" Jonas went to her and said, "Hush, hush, you fool, you must not call out." Whereupon, pulling out a knife from his pocket, he stabbed his mistress with it in the chest. While Jonas was wrestling with his mistress, she drew back the bolt of the door, tried to escape, and they struggled. She got the door open, and they both fell over the planing bench into the voorhuis. She called out, "Murder, murder, Krechman, come and help me." He pulled open the front door and fled with a knife in his hand towards Table Mountain. After committing this gross crime, he did not fear or scruple to return to the farm of his mistress the following evening in order to sleep there. Oh yeah, the fiscal was right. This is what they were doing. And thus he fell into the hands of justice. They found him hidden among the peas in the little garden behind the house and captured him. His sentence was to be handed over to the executioner, and his right hand was chopped off, and then the hand and a knife was hung above his head, and then he was flayed with a rope until he died. That wasn't enough. They then dragged the body through the streets to the outer place of execution, Gallows Hill, Green Point. You can read all about it in our book. To be hanged again with the severed hand and the knife above the head, and to remain like that until being consumed by the air and the birds of heaven. Gallows Hill was in full sight of all the ships in the harbour. That's why. You couldn't see this from the harbour. So the punishment would take place outside the castle, and then the visible warning would be hung up on Gallows Hill. So what changed during the 18th century? Scale. The town spread, filled the gaps between the outer streets. Outer streets, Buitenkant, Buitengracht, and Buitensingel. Also style, symmetry, patterning. Here's a recognisable Cape Town. The sweeping panoramas painted by Johannes Schumacher in 1777 show an organised, apportioned, a settled place. The pictures of an orderly, genteel landscape, respectable, repetitive properties. It presented a homogeneous facade to the world. Cape Town was now a mature town with a Cape Dutch character and style. By 1786, when the Lutheran pastor Jan Brandes reported the townhouse styles of Strand Street, flat roof buildings had largely replaced the older single-storey thatched types. As families settled, grew and prospered, their properties architecturally reflect a maturing town, and, as in the countryside, differentiations of wealth and status as well. However, while there were still some streets with more, there were streets with more imposing houses, such as Heerengracht. Generally, the lives of rich and poor were still mingled in the late 18th century. Even though their separate identities were deeply inscribed in the language of official documents, by name, occupation, employment, honorific, level of freedom, wealth, company employee, colonist, master, apprentice, slave, residents and visitors lived on neighbouring plots or shared physical spaces. What's more, there were endlessly repeated edicts from government, plakaten. Keep the streets and canals clean. Lock up your pigs and goats, which speaks to a reality much dirtier and smellier than that which Schumacher and Brandes depicted. Thank you. please ask questions. I'm just doing some advertising. You'll get more advertising during the week. There's our Place and History Trust project. Those are online, free downloadable. And that's who we are. Yes?
Antonia, a question about reading Old Dutch in the documents. What is your best resource for doing that? Is it modern Dutch, Afrikaans? How does one get into those Old Dutch documents? How did you get into it?
I didn't have any Afrikaans and I didn't have any Dutch when I started reading the Inventories, which ironically was a very good thing. Because what happened was I had to scribble out every single word and work out what it meant. One thing, I used pre-war Dutch dictionaries because the language has changed so dramatically since the war. And there's some wonderful Flemish sources as well. The second thing is that simple words like, I'm trying to think, describing furniture or materials have changed over time. The meaning has changed and you make assumptions. And that also, when I came to the English, the inventories written in English, I never took for granted that I knew what that word meant. So it took me a couple of years to learn. If you're working with inventories, it's like a laundry list, it's repetitive. You know, once you've got the vocabulary, it's a very small vocabulary. I can't do the more technical stuff. We have developed a basic glossary to help people. It's just something we've never had time to develop. It's on our wish list. For reading the actual writing, there are guides to how to read old things. And essentially, it is just practice, practice, practice. You just sit down and start somewhere, and it's like learning a language. Doesn't help, does it?
And Antonia, just a side issue. Have you found any definite connection between the stench of lawyers' plain and the later named Bouquet Street?
Nice point. We'll develop that one. I'll leave that one up to you.
Dan Slay has the theory, and nobody's ever proved it or disproved it.
Yes, it's a very good question, because I mean, certainly in those days you walked around with strong smelling bags.
Yes.
And you smoked them too.
Those Germans came. What was the reason?
Sorry?
What made the German come here and be business people?
Good, very good question. Yes, I've glossed over all sorts of stuff, I'm assuming you know. Ironically, the majority of employees of the Dutch East India Company were German born, were from the German area. Remember that that part of Europe had undergone, whatever it was, the 7 Years' War? There were a lot.
30 years.
30? Yes. Lots of war. 30 years. There were a lot of displaced people. And one of the opportunities would be to join the West India Company or the East India Company.
Because the French definitely had a reason to come.
Yes, so did the Germans. They were strictly they were economic refugees. And be careful what you call it.
And then they had to flee, and then they were
correct.
Had to come here. But the Germans, why did they come?
For the work, for the opportunity, and they did very well.
Yes,
they did extremely well. And there were Swedes and some English as well. Yes.
That's just to add to that question. The 30 Years' War ended in 1648, 4 years before Jan van Riebeeck arrived. During the 30 Years' War, which was a mainly religious, firstly religious, Protestant, Catholic, but later on marauding bands, Swedes included, devastated Germany. The population during that war, and pestilence and disease shrunk from 18 million to 6 million.
Shocking.
And Holland then was a thriving economy.
See, there was no reason for the
So
Dutch
they
to
were-
come. They were doing well.
And yeah,
Yeah,
quite a number of Germans went there to find work.
that's right. That's right. Or they were scraped up off the streets of Amsterdam.
What's the relation between your project and the TANAP project that you can find online?
Oh, yes. Well, it's jolly nearly one and the same. The TANAP project started, it's Dutch funded, and it was to transcribe the resolutions of the Cape. In other words, the official minutes of Cape governments. And Dan Slay was involved in that, and Helena Niedenberg, who was our chief editor. She'll be talking tomorrow. When that project finished, the Dutch were looking for another project to fund. Okay. One of the awkward things at that period was that funding had to go to, it was government to government. And in 2004, it was quite tricky to get people to make decisions. So in the end, the consulate came to Nigel and said, look, have you got a project we can fund? And so he got hold of a bunch of us and said, what would you think? And asked me, would I be available to manage it? And I said, yeah, I'll manage it, provided that the project is to transcribe my favourite documents, which happen to be the English. So the deal was cut. When that then became a so-called TEPC project, which was ran for another 4 years, to 2004. When that was also Dutch funded. When that ended, we had this professional team of experts doing stuff which nobody else either wants or can do, with an international kind of standards. And we thought, we can't let this go. We're going to have to manage it ourselves. So we set up the Tracing History Trust for that purpose, and we struggled and struggled and struggled. Over the years, literally at one stage we had a book project, whereby people could give us 500 Rand or 5,000 Rand just to do a volume. And we just kept ticking over, and then money started coming in. We are now in a position where if all our birds come home to roost, we're going to have to train 2 new teams. So you'll hear about that. So it's a direct relationship, yes.
Tell me.
Sorry, did it me?
I don't know if it was First Ladies.
Oh.
I wanted to find out about the fort. Was that the first building in the Cape? The Cape Town fort?
Yeah, they started building the fort. Actually, I think the hospital was the most important. The planting of trees and vegetables, and then the fort. So that was not where the castle is now. We can go back to. Do you want to see? It was under the parade, under today's parade, and it was an earthen fort, timber and earthen fort, and it kept falling down in the rain. So then they built the stone.
The castle, and when was that built?
It was finished in 1699, and it was, just moving all those rocks. It was like a tax. Anybody driving their cart through town had to bring some rocks. It's very unpopular. Yes.